Hello and welcome back to Whispers from History, the place where myths unfold gently and the sea of stories never rushes. Tonight, we drift into the depths of time to meet a god whose power lies not only in waves and storms, but in stillness, in patience, in presence. This is the story of Poseidon, god of the ocean, keeper of silence, and watcher of the world's forgotten moments. Not told in thunder or wrath, but in the slow rhythm of tides, in quiet longing, in calm after chaos. So take a deep breath. Let the sound of waves carry your thoughts away. Close your eyes and float gently into the ocean of a god's memory. Water Wave Chapter 1, born from the depths. Long before the tides, long before waves curled themselves along sandy shores, before the names of gods were whispered beneath marble roofs, there was only stillness, a silence before creation. From that silence came time, and from time came chaos, and from chaos the first breath of earth and sky. From those first breaths, the Titans were born, great beings of vast strength and form, who ruled the world in its earliest shape. Among them were Cronus and Rhea, the father and mother of what would one day become Olympus. Cronus, fearful of being overthrown by his children, as he had once overthrown his own father, Uranus, devoured each newborn the moment they emerged from the womb. Swallowed whole, sealed away not in death, but in timeless darkness, 5 children slept inside the belly of time itself. The 6th child, however, did not meet this fate. This child would be named Zeus, and he would be hidden, nurtured in secret, and destined to return with thunder in his voice. But before the storm, before the sky was reclaimed, those swallowed children still waited, unborn gods suspended in silence. Among them was Poseidon. Poseidon did not know light, not then. He did not know breath, nor body, nor even name. He was potential, curled in darkness, held in the still warmth of Rhea's womb before being taken into the silent prison of Cronus's fear. He existed as memory not yet made, as power not yet given shape. There, inside that timeless cavern of the Titan's gut, Poseidon drifted, not dreaming, not thinking, but waiting. When Zeus grew strong enough to challenge the old order, the world shook. Time cracked open. Cronus was forced to regurgitate what he had taken, and one by one, the swallowed gods returned. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and then Poseidon. He did not emerge screaming. He did not demand. He came into the world like the sea itself, deep, vast, and unknowable. He had not seen the sky, but he understood depth. He had not yet touched land, but his spirit knew movement. And as he stepped into the light of the world for the first time, the waters stirred in response. They did not yet have a ruler, but they already knew his name. The war that followed, the Titanomachy, was thunder and rage, lightning against mountain, fire against time. Poseidon fought beside Zeus and Hades, the 3 brothers rising like pillars out of the wreckage of the old world. But unlike Zeus, who roared with storm and justice, or Hades, who moved in silence and shadow, Poseidon was something between. His power was not in fire or wind, but in pull and release. His presence was felt in pressure, in silence before waves broke, in the swell beneath ships. He wielded a trident forged by the Cyclopes, a symbol of control over the element that moved even when unseen. He did not speak often, but when he drove that trident into the earth, the world listened. And when the war was over, when the Titans had fallen and the world stood trembling under new rule, the 3 brothers cast lots to divide all that had been won. Zeus took the sky, Hades took the underworld, and to Poseidon the sea was given not as a consolation, but as a realm as deep as the cosmos, as wide as time. The sea was not only water, it was mystery, it was memory, and it was his. The first time Poseidon stood before the sea, the world held its breath. He had walked for days through the newly ordered earth, where rivers carved their paths through soft stone and green life stretched upward, still unsure of its form. His feet, solid and slow, carried the weight of power he did not yet fully understand. And then, through mist and salt and sky, he came to the place where land stopped. Before him stretched the unknown, a vast surface that shifted endlessly, glowing with reflected sky. The sea did not roar, not yet. It was quiet, almost watchful. And Poseidon, shaped in silence, stepped forward. As his bare feet touched the wet edge of the world, the waves pulled inward. It was not fear nor submission. It was recognition. The water knew him, and he knew it, not in thought but in the marrow of his being. There was no ceremony, no declaration, but in that moment, the sea became his not through conquest, but through echo. A god, born in darkness, met a realm that had waited without a name, and together they breathed. The sea was not like the sky, which stretched but did not yield, nor was it like the underworld, where boundaries held souls in careful stillness. The sea moved, always, even when still it shifted, even when calm it spoke in rhythm. Poseidon did not command it, not at first. He listened. Days passed with him simply standing at its edge, watching its moods, how it danced with wind, how it grew heavy before a storm, how it whispered against the shore with secrets no one had yet learned to hear. He would step into its shallows, then deeper until the water curled around his waist, then his shoulders, then above his head. It did not close over him, it welcomed him. Down he sank, not with weight but with purpose. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. There, in the quiet belly of the sea, he opened his eyes and saw a realm not of chaos, but of layers. Fish darted like thought, light twisted into columns. And further still, in the cold and dark, there was vastness. The kind of vastness that matched the space he had once drifted through inside Cronus. But this time it was his to shape. So he began, slowly, not with thunder or quakes, but with presence. The seabed rearranged itself to his passing. Caves opened, then closed. Coral grew in rings, and somewhere, where the water was neither warm nor cold, he formed a palace, not of gold, but of salt and stillness. Its walls shifted with current. Its halls echoed with silence. Amphitrite, the sea nymph who would become his queen, watched from afar, then came to walk beside him, not as a subject, but as one who also belonged. The sea did not need walls. It needed watchers. It needed breath. And Poseidon, born in darkness, now moved through light that filtered from above, casting patterns on the floor like thoughts he had not yet spoken. In time, he would raise storms. He would shake the earth. But in those first days, Poseidon was simply present. He listened to the sea, and it listened back. As Poseidon settled into his realm, the ocean began to change. Not suddenly, not violently, but with the slow certainty of tides turning under moonlight. The sea grew deeper in places where he had walked. Currents began to swirl around his movements, gentle at first, then more purposeful. He did not shape the sea with force. He shaped it through presence. It was a realm that did not respond to commands, but to feeling. When Poseidon was calm, the waves lapped gently across the shores of distant lands. When he was uncertain, they trembled slightly, as though mirroring his thoughts beneath the surface. And when he began to feel peace, true quiet peace, the sea mirrored it back with stillness so wide, so clear, that dolphins danced in its open mirror and birds skimmed its surface without fear. This was the truth he came to understand. He and the sea were not separate. They were reflections. He was not its master. He was its voice. though his brothers ruled realms of structure. The sky with its high throne and lightning law, the underworld with its gates and judgment. Poseidon's domain was unbound. There were no walls, no borders. The sea touched every shore. It whispered to rivers, tugged at lakes, stirred beneath the rain. He could feel it all. Every pull of tide against rock, every shifting grain of sand at the bottom of an unseen bay. The ocean was not silent. It was endlessly speaking in a language few had ever truly heard. And Poseidon listened. He became fluent in the speech of depths. The creak of a coral reef blooming in darkness, the shimmer of fish passing in swarms, the groan of stone reshaping itself beneath pressure and time. Every sound, every current, every motion, it all lived within him. He did not need temples to know he was a god. The sea was his temple, and within it he was never alone. Yet even as he grew into his power, Poseidon remained a god of mystery. While Zeus made declarations from the heights and Hades kept silent vigil in shadow, Poseidon moved in rhythms. He would vanish into the depths for what seemed like ages, only to rise suddenly in great waves that touched the sky. Mortals would speak of him with awe and fear, not because he was cruel, but because he was vast, because he was unseen until he chose to rise. But in these early days, before his storms, before the shaking of earth and wrath of crashing seas, Poseidon was something else. He was stillness. He was slow discovery. He was the moment before the wave. And in that space he learned to breathe not with lungs but with water, not with noise but with knowing. He learned that the sea did not serve. It existed, and in its existing it made space for all things. For ship and stone, for pearl and silence, for gods and dreams. And so, in the quiet garden of endless blue, Poseidon became not just a ruler. He became the sea itself. Waterwave Chapter 2, The Sea as Home. In the early age of the gods' rule, the sea was vast and unclaimed. It stretched beyond mortal sight, far past the edge of memory, reaching into places where even the stars hesitated to reflect. No walls marked its borders. No laws tethered its winds. It was raw, infinite, and endlessly shifting. A space between spaces, a mirror that showed not what was, but what might become. And in this boundless place, Poseidon walked, not as a stranger, but as one slowly returning to where he'd always belonged. Though the sky roared with Zeus's voice, and the underworld held its breath in Hades's quiet judgment, the sea whispered. It murmured truths too old for language, and Poseidon, who had once known only darkness and then light, listened to it as he would to an old friend. He did not rise to a throne. There was no crown placed upon his head. His rule came through rhythm, not rule. He moved with the currents, and in time the currents moved with him. Whales followed his wake not in obedience, but in recognition. Coral grew in spirals where he paused to think. Even the smallest of fish seemed to sense when he passed nearby, shifting in synchronized stillness before continuing on. Poseidon did not need to build monuments. The sea built them for him, sculpting its beds and trenches with patient grace. Great caverns yawned open in places no eye would see, not because they were commanded, but because the sea desired to shelter its god. And he, in return, gave it shape. He brought balance where chaos had ruled. He stirred currents where stagnation clung, but always he did so without force. He was not a god of conquest. He was a god of presence. Still, the sea was not simple. It held moods as shifting as the clouds, emotions that ran deeper than time itself. Some days it was still, like glass stretched to the horizon. Other days, it churned with unseen storms. Its unrest stirring in spirals Poseidon could feel in the bones of the world. He did not try to stop these moods. He let them move through him, felt them as his own. And slowly, he began to understand the sea not just as a place, but as a self. It had will. It had memory. It had secrets. Sometimes, it whispered to him of things that had not yet happened. Ships not yet built. Storms not yet born. Other times, it sang of long-gone creatures, extinct but still echoing in the depths. Poseidon would sit at the edge of the trench and listen, not to rule, not to control, but to be part of it. The sea did not belong to him. He belonged to the sea, and in that surrender, he found something the sky and the underworld could never offer. A home that was always in motion, and yet always waiting. Poseidon's days in the sea were not counted in hours or rotations of the sun, but in sensations. The tickle of sediment along his ankles, the slow bloom of jellyfish rising like lanterns in the dark, the echo of whale song traveling for miles, brushing gently against his skin like a greeting from a distant world. Time here did not move forward. It circled, pulsed, drifted. It expanded and contracted like breath. He wandered through sunlit shallows where silver fish darted in schools, then dove into the cold silence of the abyss, where light never touched and pressure wrapped around the body like an embrace. In the darkness, he was not afraid. He felt whole. There was something honest about the depth. Nothing to distract, nothing to prove. In these places, he learned patience. The sea did not reveal its secrets all at once. It unfolded them slowly, like a tide pulling back to show what had been buried beneath. And Poseidon, once a god of impulse and untested power, began to slow, to listen, to know that not all silence was emptiness. He built nothing permanent at first, for in the sea nothing lasts unchanged. Towers of coral rose, then crumbled. Gardens of kelp swayed with the currents, reshaping themselves with every passing moon. Even the creatures that lived in his realm came and went, leaving behind trails in sand that vanished moments later. And yet, this impermanence did not trouble him, comforted him. There was a rhythm in the way things arrived and departed, a balance in the absence of control. He did not try to stop the flow of life. Instead, he watched it. He learned that the sea was not something to be mastered, but something to be joined. Its vastness was not empty space. It was space that made room for everything. When storms formed on the surface, he would feel their tremble in his chest before they even touched the waves. When ships crossed above, he felt the shadow of their passage, and sometimes reached up, not to strike, but to touch, just for a moment, the world above. Still, Poseidon remained unseen by most. Sailors spoke of him in stories, calling him the Earthshaker, the Stormbringer, the one who could sink an armada with a thought. But they did not know the god who sat for hours watching a sea turtle make its slow pilgrimage across the reef. They did not hear the lullabies he hummed to the currents when no one listened. They knew only the rage, the waves, the trident striking stone. But Poseidon knew that true power did not always roar. Sometimes it was the silence before a wave, the weight of water holding a ship steady, the way salt air softened the edge of grief. He did not need mortals to see him. He did not even need them to believe. He had found something older than worship, something deeper than dominion. In the sea, he had found a self that did not need to rise or rule. He had found stillness. He had found home. As the years passed, though years held no meaning beneath the waves, Poseidon became less a visitor to the sea and more a part of its memory. His form remained godlike. Yes, tall, strong, eyes the color of stormlit surf. But his presence shifted. When he moved, the currents moved with him, not in reverence, but in rhythm. When he breathed, the surface trembled slightly, as though exhaling with him. Creatures that once fled now swam closer, not because they understood what he was, but because they recognized something in him, a a stillness deep and old, like the trenches they instinctively avoided but never feared. He did not command them. He didn't need to. His rule was not the kind written in decree or carved into temple walls. It was written in the tide itself, in the moon's gentle pull, in the hush that comes just before the waves reach your feet. In time, even the sea forgot the moment it had become his. Simply knew he was part of it now. Poseidon found himself drifting more often, not out of aimlessness, but because the sea was never truly still. Even when his body rested, his mind wandered through the layers of water. He could sense storms forming hundreds of miles away, their tension building in the warm air above, pressing down onto the ocean's skin like an anxious breath. He could feel ships crossing from shore to shore, their wooden bodies creaking in protest, guided by hope and fear and stars. He rarely interfered, but he always felt them. The sea told him everything, not in words, but in pulses, in tremors, in salt. He began to feel what others could not, that the sea was not separate from the land or sky, but the space that held them both. It was the memory between worlds, and he was its keeper, its voice, its calm. Sometimes, when the world above grew too loud, when Olympus buzzed with disputes, when mortals shouted their prayers into wind, Poseidon would retreat to the deepest parts of the ocean, not to hide but to rest. There, in darkness untouched by sun or sound, he would float, surrounded by silence so pure it felt like the womb of the world. And in that space, he would remember who he had been before the war, before the titles, before the myths. Not a god, not a king, just a presence, a witness, a rhythm waiting to be named. And the sea, sensing his stillness, would cradle him. Its pressure, its cold, its endless blue, all of it wrapped around him like a breath that never ends. And Poseidon, Earthshaker, god of the oceans, would smile in the dark, because in that quiet, in that perfect stillness, he knew the truth of his realm. The sea was not just his home, it was his reflection. Chapter 3: The Trident and the Tide. Long before Poseidon raised storms or split rock with a single blow, before the myths turned him into a figure of wrath and vengeance, he was given a gift, not as a weapon, but as a promise. The Cyclopes, ancient beings of flame and forge, once imprisoned by the Titans, had been freed by Zeus during the war that changed the order of the world. In gratitude, they offered gifts to the three brothers who would now shape the cosmos. To Zeus, they gave thunder and lightning, raw, fast, and blinding. To Hades, a helm of invisibility, a crown of silence that allowed him to move unseen through shadow. And to Poseidon, they forged a trident, a three-pronged spear, glowing not with fire, but with balance. It shimmered with the colors of deep water, blue so dark it was almost black, and silver that pulsed like light filtered through waves. When Poseidon first held it, the sea stirred, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. This was not a weapon made for conquest. It was a key to his realm, a conductor of will and water. The trident was not light. It was not heavy either. It felt exactly right in his hands, as though it had waited for him, as though it had been shaped not by hammer but by knowing. When he lifted it, waves leaned forward. When he lowered it, the currents pulled back. He did not need to strike with it to make the earth tremble, though it held that power. He did not need to raise it to summon storms, though the clouds would answer. But more than that, the trident allowed him to feel his realm more deeply. With it, he could sense the weight of tides on distant shores, hear the rumble of shifting sand beneath the ocean's skin, trace the thin silver trails of migrating creatures in the midnight zones. It tuned him to the sea, like a breath aligns to a heartbeat. He did not carry it always. Often, it floated beside him, or disappeared into water, waiting to be called again. But even when absent, its presence lingered, not as a weapon slung across a shoulder, but as a note sustained in silence. Mortals would later tell tales of Poseidon's rage, of him striking his trident against cliffs and cracking islands in two, of him slamming it into the sea and sending walls of water against coastal cities. And yes, when provoked, when dishonored, when balance was broken, he could call upon the trident to restore what was out of place. But such moments were rare. The truth, less told, is that Poseidon used the trident not to destroy, but to maintain. He would press it gently into the seafloor to redirect a current that threatened to erode coral nurseries. He would tap it once against stone to still a fault line trembling too soon. He would draw quiet circles in the water, calming whirlpools that had spun too wide. The trident was not simply a symbol of dominance. It was a staff of listening, a wand of rhythm, a mirror of the god himself, powerful, yes, but more than that, present. A reminder that true strength does not live in the moment of impact, but in the steady, unseen hand that prevents the need to strike at all. In time, the trident became more than a tool, it became a language. It spoke not in words, but in touch, in weight, in silence. Poseidon learned to trace its tips across the surface of the sea and read the stories left there. The journey of a lost ship swallowed by fog, the restless stirrings of sea creatures gathering before a change in current, the subtle cry of a distant reef suffering under sudden warmth. With each gesture, he was not simply observing, he was responding. He could turn the tide a fraction, redirect a wave so that it would break more gently on a vulnerable shore. He could bring nutrients up from the cold, dark deep to feed blooms of plankton where whales would feed. And all of this he did in stillness, with the trident like a conductor's baton, guiding the great symphonic breathing of the world beneath the waves. Mortals would never know of these small adjustments, these silent kindnesses. They would only feel the soft balance of a calm season, the unexpected safety of a voyage spared from storm. Sometimes Poseidon would take the trident into the deepest trenches and hold it upright in the ocean floor. There, in the place where light could not reach, he would close his eyes and listen. The sea would pulse around him, not as water but as memory, the slow recall of ancient whales, the echo of ice long melted, the throb of magma beneath the crust. And through the trident, he would hear the world not as a noise, but as a rhythm. The trident was like a needle set to the heart of the sea, and Poseidon, its quiet reader. It grounded him, reminded him that even gods must listen, that power without presence becomes noise. But with presence, with quiet care, even a gesture could ripple across continents, not in violence, but in harmony. He did not always carry it because he didn't need to. The sea remembered it, and when he needed it, it would rise from the deep like a thought made solid. On rare nights, Poseidon would rise from the water's surface and walk the shoreline. The trident would appear beside him, not blazing, not humming, simply there. The sand would part beneath its tips. The wind would fall still. And sometimes, in the space between waves and stars, he would press it lightly into the earth. Not to split it, but to remind it. I see you. I feel you. I am still here. And the land would echo faintly in return. A shift beneath the soil. A sigh beneath the roots of trees. It was not fear, but recognition. Even the mountains remembered the sea. And through the trident, Poseidon was a bridge between the two. He did not raise it in conquest. He did not wield it as threat. He used it as a listener uses stillness, as something sacred, as something that holds the world together not through force, but through balance. As ages passed and myths grew, the image of Poseidon with his trident became etched into marble and memory. Mortals carved him with fierce brows and storming eyes, the trident held high, crashing into the earth or slicing the sky. They feared the god of the oceans, and so they imagined his power as noise, as violence. But the truth was quieter. The trident, like the god who bore it, was not born for anger. It was born for understanding. When Poseidon looked at it, not as a weapon but as a symbol, he saw not three sharp points of destruction, but three paths converging: movement, stillness, and listening. The first prong, the tide that moves without end, sweeping life forward whether it's ready or not. The second, the still pool, reflecting moonlight, asking nothing but presence. And the third, the undertow, the unseen current pulling deep, where truth lies far beneath the surface. These were not tools of war. They were aspects of the world itself. The trident was not his alone. It belonged to the sea, and to all who dared to live within it. There were times when Poseidon left the trident resting upright in the center of his palace, where it glowed with soft light in the ever-moving hall of coral and current. It did not need guards. No creature touched it, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Sea serpents passed by slowly, giving it wide berth. Dolphins clicked their greetings from afar. Even the youngest fish, newly born in swirling clouds, turned instinctively away from it, not in panic but in peace, like a child who sees a candle and understands not to grasp it. And Poseidon, watching, would smile faintly. He did not hoard power. He did not lock it away. He let the trident exist in full view because he trusted the sea. He trusted its creatures. Power, he had learned, was not about possession. It was about presence, about being part of something larger than yourself and tending to it with care. One night, in the quiet between seasons, Poseidon stood at the edge of the deepest drop in his domain, where the sea fell away into a darkness even gods could not fully illuminate. He held the trident lightly in one hand, its three prongs casting long shadows across the soft glow of drifting plankton. The ocean pulsed around him, slow and ancient. Not a single fish stirred. He looked at the trident, then at the waters below, and he whispered, not with voice, but with heart, "If I am lost, may you remember me. If I grow silent, may you carry my rhythm. If I ever leave, may you remain." The sea responded, not in words, but in warmth, curling around him like a blanket made of breath. He let the trident go, and it sank for a moment, only to rise again, slowly, gently, and rest in his open palm. It had answered. It always would, because the trident was not a thing apart from him. It was the shape of his promise, to move when needed, to wait when stillness was wiser, and to always, always listen. Chapter 4: Storms of Temper, Pools of Calm. Not all gods are calm, and not all storms are loud. Poseidon, for all his stillness, carried within him a vastness that few could ever comprehend, a sea of feeling as deep as the ocean itself. He was, after all, the god of movement, and even the gentlest tide must crash upon the shore eventually. There were days when he rose from the depths not as a whisper, but as a wave. Days when something stirred in him too large to name, and the sky above the sea darkened in answer. These were not outbursts. They were not rage in the way mortals understood it. They were the breaking point of pressure long held, release, not fury. The storm did not begin with thunder. It began with silence. A silence so deep it felt like the ocean had forgotten how to breathe. Dolphins vanished. Whales dove. Even the waves paused. The sea itself waited, sensing something within its god. And Poseidon, alone in his palace of coral and current, would close his eyes and let the tension rise, not to lash out, but because the sea needed to move, and so did he. He never shouted. His anger had no voice. Instead, the water responded to his emotion as if it were its own. A sudden surge might crash into a coastline without warning, not to destroy, but to express something that could not stay hidden. Ships would rock in distant ports without wind. The sky would tremble in gray stillness. It was a language too old for words, a storm that carried no hatred, only weight. And after it passed, after the pressure was released, Poseidon would sink back into the depths and let the quiet return. He was not proud of these moments, but he was not ashamed either. The sea had moods, so did he, and like all things that live in rhythm, those moods had to move, to rise, to fall. Sometimes the trident would hum in his hand before he even knew what he felt. Sometimes the current would pull against him gently, as if to say, "It's all right, let it out, let it pass." And it always did, because the sea forgives, and Poseidon, when he listened, forgave himself. But there was another side to him that few ever saw, a calm so complete, so profound, that it stilled even the most restless tides. On days when the sea was glass and the sky a pale mirror, Poseidon would sit cross-legged on the ocean floor, hands resting loosely in his lap, eyes closed. Around him, manta rays would glide in wide circles. Seaweed would sway like breath, and not a single creature would disturb him. He didn't meditate in the way mortals did. He simply became the water, motion without effort, presence without thought. In these moments, he could feel every drop in the ocean, every ripple on the surface, every grain of sand shifting gently in the current. He did not smile. He did not speak. He simply was. These were the days the world stayed quiet. Storms waited. Earthquakes paused. The ocean listened, because in that stillness, Poseidon reminded all things that power is not always force, that the most enduring strength is not the wave that crashes, but the water that yields and returns, again and again, forever. There were times when Poseidon wished he could be more like his brothers. Zeus, ever watchful in the sky, passed judgment from above with a clarity that seemed untouched by doubt. Hades, silent in his underworld halls, remained steady and unmoved, even as countless souls passed before him. But Poseidon was different. His heart beat like waves against a cliff, always in motion, always returning, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce. He envied their distance, their ability to separate themselves from the world they ruled. Poseidon could never step back. The sea did not allow it. It lived inside him, pulling at his thoughts like the moon pulls at the tide. A sudden sadness in the deep ocean trench would weigh upon his chest. A bloom of fish struggling to breathe in warming waters would echo like a faint ache in his temples. He did not choose what to feel. He simply felt all of it. And because the sea was so vast, so layered, so old, there were days when its endless emotion overwhelmed even him. And in these moments, the calm within him would falter, not explode, but tremble, not lash out, but withdraw. He would retreat from the surface and descend into the places no light touched, letting the weight of water press against his body like a heavy cloak. There, in the darkness, he would float, not thinking, not commanding, just being. The sea, sensing his state, would cradle him in silence. No current would stir, no creature would approach. Time would stop, and in that sacred stillness, Poseidon would begin to come back to himself, not by force, but by surrender. He would release what did not belong to him. The anger of mortals, the pressure of storms, the unspoken grief of the planet. He would exhale it slowly, like salt leaving a wound, and the sea would take it, hold it, dissolve it. That was the gift of his realm. It did not judge. It did not resist. It received everything and made space for it to pass. And Poseidon, once again light within his own heart, would rise through the darkness, pulled not by duty but by peace. Over time, he learned to trust this cycle, not to fight the tide of emotion, but to follow it. He saw that even rage had a rhythm, and even sadness could lead to stillness if allowed to breathe. He stopped fearing the storm within him and began to study it. What shape did it take? What silence did it follow? What balance waited beneath its roar? These were not questions of power, but of presence. And as he listened, really listened, he found that his greatest strength was not in quelling storms, but in allowing them to end. Not in resisting his own feeling, but in guiding it safely back to calm. The ocean taught him that even chaos has a center, and he was that center, a point of stillness in the middle of all things shifting. It was not easy, it was not always beautiful, but it was true, and truth, like the sea, always finds its way back. In later generations, mortals would write poems and prayers to calm Poseidon's wrath. They built temples near harbors, offered wine and silver, cast wreaths into the tide hoping to buy a moment of mercy. But they misunderstood. Poseidon was not a god who demanded appeasement. He was not cruel, nor was his anger the kind that could be bribed. His storms were not punishment, they were conversation. His waves, his quakes, his trembling sea, they were the voice of a realm too vast to ignore. And yet, deep within, Poseidon held no hatred for mortals. In truth, he pitied them. They lived beside a world they could not hear. They crossed his waters in wooden boats and whispered his name with fear, never knowing that he heard not their words, but the quiet in between. It was not their offerings that touched him. It was their stillness. The rare moments when a fisherman paused to watch the sun dissolve into the horizon, or when a sailor stood in the dead calm of the ocean and felt, for a moment, like part of something endless. Those were the moments Poseidon listened to most, not with judgment, but with something like love. There were times, in secret, when he would rise quietly from the sea at dusk, far from temples and eyes, and walk among the rocks near forgotten shores. He would listen to the wind weave through coastal trees, feel the sand slip beneath his feet, and stand still as the stars began to appear. In those moments, he was not a god, not a legend, not a force of nature. He was simply part of the world, like the stone, the sky, the water, the wind, and he would remember the quiet before his birth, the hush inside Cronus, the waiting in darkness that taught him how to feel. It was not rage that defined him. It was memory, patience, presence. He had learned over time that the most sacred thing he could offer to the world was not the storm, but the calm that followed it. Not the trembling of cliffs, but the still pool left behind when the waves withdrew. And so Poseidon became a god of rhythm, not perfection, not detachment, but rhythm. He moved through his realm with a breath both heavy and light, willing to rise, willing to fall, never clinging to either. He was not the calm or the storm. He was both. He did not deny the sea its sorrow, its pressure, its fury, but he also never let those things consume him. He held them as the ocean holds all things, lightly but fully. And in doing so, he taught the world a quiet lesson. That strength is not the absence of feeling, but the ability to carry it. To feel deeply and still choose stillness. To rise in anger when needed, and then return to the silence beneath all things. In this, Poseidon found not only peace, but a kind of wisdom that even Olympus could not name. He did not need to speak it. The sea spoke it for him, with every wave, every breath, every calm between storms. Chapter 5: The Cities He Loved and Lost. Among the gods, Poseidon was perhaps the most generous to mortals, not in golden laws or shining signs, but in gifts that could not be measured. Springs where no water had flowed, harbors that bent safely into land, islands that rose like sleeping giants from the sea, their shores fertile and full. He gave not with speeches, but with presence. When a people settled near his waters, he watched them, not as a ruler, but as a neighbor. He felt their nets in the currents, heard their songs above the surf, tasted their offerings in the salt. And in return he gave gently, small shifts in current to guide fish into their path, winds that helped their sails just before storm, a calm that lasted one night longer when they were afraid. He did not need temples to care, but he hoped quietly that they might one day see him not as a threat, but as a companion. And so he came once to a city just beginning, built on high rock, where sea met sky and clean white cliffs. The people were clever, brave, and full of spirit, and Poseidon loved them at once. He rose from the water and approached their leaders, trident lowered, voice soft. He offered them a gift, a spring from the heart of the ocean, salt-fed, eternal, a promise of connection to the sea forever. From the cliffside he struck his trident into the rock, and water burst forth, strong and cold, singing like the breath of the tide. The people gathered in awe, watching it flow, but they hesitated, for another god had come, Athena, daughter of wisdom and war. She offered them something different, an olive tree, modest in size but full of patience, shade, fruit, oil. The people paused. They weighed the sea's roar against the hush of branches, and in the end they chose her. They chose land over sea, stillness over movement, strategy over feeling. They called their city Athens. Poseidon did not rage. Not then. He turned from the cliff, stepped once more into the waves, and let the sea close behind him. But something inside him shifted, not broken, but bruised. Not because they had rejected his gift, but because they had not understood it. They had seen the sea only for its danger, its salt, its storms. Not for its depth, not for its endlessness. Not for the way it holds all things, carries all things, gives and gives without question. He did not curse them. He did not return with waves. He simply left. The spring remained, but its song was quieter now, its flow less bright, and Poseidon, back in the deep, drifted alone. This was the pain only gods knew. To love from a distance, to offer freely, and to be seen only for your shadow. Still, he did not stop giving. There were other cities, other shores, other people to watch, to protect, to love in silence. In the centuries that followed, Poseidon visited many more cities. He did not always reveal himself in form. Sometimes he was the breeze that turned a sail just in time, or the deep current that saved a vessel from running aground. Other times he walked the shores as a fisherman or sat beneath olive trees disguised as a traveler. He did not seek glory. He sought connection. He wanted to see how humans lived beside the sea. Not just upon it, but with it. In a port town nestled in the arms of a crescent bay, he gifted deep-water harbors, safe from storms. The people there prospered. They carved dolphins into stone and sang lullabies to the ocean, not out of fear, but gratitude. Poseidon passed through often, leaving small gifts behind. Pearls nestled in the sand, fish drawn near in lean seasons, storms softened before they made landfall. No temple was ever built there, but he loved that place more than many that bore his name. For here he was not worshipped. He was welcomed. There were cities that asked for his favor. Bold rulers who declared they would raise the greatest harbors in the world, who promised shrines and festivals and golden statues. Poseidon would listen, would watch, and sometimes he helped them. But often, their prayers were not for harmony. They were bargains, demands, promises made in hunger for power, not peace. He would feel it in the way they stood at the sea's edge, not with reverence, but with calculation. To them, the ocean was a tool, a force to tame, to use, to fence and fill with ships. Poseidon did not strike them down. He did not call waves to punish their pride. But he held back. He did not bring the same calm, the same fish, the same gentle current. not out of cruelty, but because true connection cannot be forced. And without it, the sea would not answer. Many of those cities fell in time, not by his hand, but by their own reaching. They built too high, too fast, and forgot to listen to the rhythm beneath their feet. And Poseidon, far below, watched with sorrow, not satisfaction. He longed sometimes to be chosen, not for fear, but for love. He did not envy Athena her city. He respected her deeply, and he knew the olive tree was a gift of peace and endurance. But he wished mortals saw that he, too, had offered something sacred, that the sea, with all its danger, was also a place of depth, of mystery, of memory, that it held answers to questions they hadn't yet asked. He was not just the storm, he was the silence that followed it. He was not just the tide, he was the breath between waves. But such things were hard to explain. So he returned to his waters, to the dolphins who knew his voice, to the whales who carried his dreams in song. He watched ships pass overhead and smiled when he saw a sailor pause at sunset, hand resting on the rail, eyes soft with wonder. Those were the moments that mattered, not the cities, not the altars, but the stillness that bloomed when a mortal remembered the sea was alive. And Poseidon, god of oceans and old sorrows, would keep loving from the deep. Of all the cities that ever touched the sea, none lived longer in Poseidon's heart than the ones that were lost. Not because of betrayal or neglect, but because they disappeared. Some were swallowed by the earth, their marble columns broken and softened by sand. Others faded into memory, their names spoken only in quiet stories told by fishermen to their children. But a few were taken by the sea itself, and those Poseidon remembered with the most sorrow. Not anger, never anger. He knew that time moves like a tide, that even the strongest stone can be worn down by waves. But when a city vanished beneath the water, it was as if a breath had been drawn and never exhaled. Their streets became coral beds. Their plazas echoed only with the shifting of shells. And though mortals saw ruins, Poseidon saw something different. He saw laughter once shared along the docks. He saw lanterns swinging in sea breeze. He saw lovers holding hands near the shoreline. These places were never truly gone. They lived on in him, like salt in his blood. There were whispers, even among gods, of a city beneath the waves, Atlantis. A place of light and learning, harmony and song. A city Poseidon had once touched not as a god, but as a man. It is said he fell in love there, not with power, but with someone who understood the sea the way he did. Someone who listened when he spoke of silence. With them, he dreamed not of ruling, but of resting, of walking a world where the sea and land lived side by side, not in tension, but in rhythm. Whether the city truly existed or whether it was only a dream the sea once dreamed, Poseidon never said. But sometimes, when he drifted through a quiet trench or rested on the ocean floor, he would hum an old melody, the kind no fish had heard in millennia, and the water around him would shimmer, as if remembering, too. He never tried to rebuild those cities. That was not his way. The sea does not recreate what it takes. It holds it. It folds it gently into itself. It makes space for what was. Poseidon learned to do the same. He carried these lost places not as burdens, but as echoes. When he walked the seabed and came upon a broken statue, he would pause and run his fingers over its surface, not to mourn, but to witness, to say, "I remember you," and then he would move on. The sea is always moving, but memory lingers. The cities he loved and lost had not truly vanished. They were part of the rhythm now, part of every current, every wave, every storm and stillness. And in that way, they would never be forgotten. As long as the sea moved, they would be there. And Poseidon, ancient and quiet, would carry them forward, not as ruins, but as songs. Chapter 6. The Depths of Loneliness. Beneath the waves, where sunlight fades and pressure folds the world into silence, Poseidon moved through his kingdom as if walking through memory. Fish swam by in shimmering constellations, whales passed like drifting songs, and coral forests whispered as they grew. Yet in all that life, there was stillness, an echo that never quite filled. For all his presence, for all the creatures that called the sea home, Poseidon remained alone. Not in the way mortals knew loneliness, not the ache for company, not the yearning for conversation, but in a deeper, slower way. A cosmic solitude. His brothers ruled realms filled with shape and structure. The stars and storms above, the gates and walls below. But Poseidon's world was one of endless space, where nothing stayed still and everything flowed away. He could touch the entire world and yet, at times, feel untouched by it. The sea would carry his thoughts across the globe and return to him empty. It was not cruel. It was simply vast. He remembered a time before thrones, before realms, when he and his brothers had stood together, shoulder to shoulder, uncertain, unformed, just freed from their father's prison. Back then, the world was wide open. There were no titles yet, no divisions, only potential. They had fought together, built together, laughed beneath stars newly born. But when the world was divided, sky, underworld, sea, they each stepped into their roles with purpose. Zeus became law, lightning, dominion. Hades became stillness, depth, finality. And Poseidon became movement. His realm was all that lay between. But the more he moved through his ocean kingdom, the more he sensed how far he now stood from his brothers. Olympus buzzed with voices. The underworld echoed with the shuffle of souls. But the sea spoke only in rhythm. There was no one to share its quiet with. And Poseidon, wrapped in current and lightless calm, often wondered if he had chosen freedom or exile. There were beings in the sea, of course, nymphs and naiads, beasts and beauties. He spoke with them, cared for them, loved some of them. He had children who carried parts of his spirit. Triton, whose horn calmed the waves. Rode, bright as the surface on a summer day. Theseus, who walked the land but carried Poseidon's depth in his bones. But they came and went. They had their own rhythms, their own shores to reach. None of them stayed. Not really. Even Amphitrite, the quiet queen of the sea, came to him not in passion, but in acceptance, a partnership born of shared silence, not fire. And Poseidon, who had shaped the sea and could summon storms with a breath, could not summon closeness. Not the kind that softened the hours, not the kind that filled the long stretches between tides. And so he swam on, not unhappy, but unfinished, as though some part of him had always remained above the waves, waiting on a distant shore for someone who could understand the sea. Not fear it, not worship it, but truly see it. Over time, Poseidon stopped struggling against the quiet. He learned not to fear the long stretches of silence between one wave and the next. Instead, he began to listen, not to the outside world. He had long mastered the language of currents and tides, of seabeds shifting and winds turning, but to something deeper, older, hidden within. In the depths of the ocean, far beyond the reach of moonlight or storm, there were places where not even sea creatures ventured. Great, yawning caverns where the water was so still it felt like the edge of time itself. Poseidon would descend into these places when the weight of his own heart grew too great to carry on the surface. He would go without trident, without voice, without purpose. He would simply float in the dark. And there, with nothing but silence around him, he would meet the part of himself that was most real. Not the god, not the myth, but the watcher. The one who felt, the one who remembered. In these hidden places, he could feel everything. Not just his own sorrow, but the sorrow of the sea. The grief of lost ships, the ache of broken coral, the sadness of songs never sung again. The ocean, like Poseidon, remembered what others had forgotten, and it held all of it. The joy, the destruction, the beginnings and endings. Some gods turned away from pain, locked it behind golden gates or buried it beneath polished thrones. But Poseidon could not look away. His kingdom did not allow it. The sea absorbed all things. So did he. In the deepest trench, he would stretch out his arms and let the pressure close around him, a weight not meant to crush, but to hold. And there he would cry, not in noise but in motion, a single ripple, a shift in salt, a vibration so small that only the oldest whales could feel it. He did not weep because he was weak. He wept because he was strong enough to carry it. Because sometimes to love the world is to mourn it, quietly, endlessly, without needing to be seen. But there was peace there, too, in that stillness, a kind of peace no temple could offer, no praise could imitate. It was the peace of being exactly what you are, with no need to explain. Poseidon would rise slowly from the depths after these moments, not healed, because grief is not something that breaks and repairs, but whole. He would return to the shifting tides and the gentle warmth of the sunlit shallows, where fish flickered like memories and light danced like laughter. And in those moments, he would feel not alone, but connected. Not through conversation, not through presence, but through understanding. He knew now that the sea was never meant to be filled with constant sound. It was meant to breathe, to hold space. And his loneliness was not an emptiness, but a form of love. It was the space he kept within himself for others. Even if they never arrived, even if they never stayed, the sea waited, and so did he, not with desperation, but with quiet grace. There were rare moments when mortals glimpsed the truth of him. A solitary sailor adrift after a storm, half-conscious, eyes barely open, might see a tall figure walking atop the waves, silent, watchful, not terrible but vast. A child sitting on a rocky shore, staring into the horizon long after sunset, might feel a presence in the rhythm of the waves, a quiet being watching back, not to frighten, but to keep company. Most would forget these feelings by morning, brushing them off as dreams or illusions. But Poseidon remembered. He held these flickers of contact as gently as one might hold a seashell to the ear, listening not for confirmation, but for comfort. In those small touches, brief and wordless, he felt less apart. Not because someone worshipped him, not because they spoke his name, but because, just for a moment, they had met him in his natural form, not as a god to be feared, but as a presence to be felt. And for that moment he was not alone. He began to realize, over centuries, that loneliness was not the same as being unloved. He had been loved in flashes, in quiet gestures, in the long memory of the sea. He was loved by the water itself, which cradled him every day without demand. He was loved by the creatures that swam beside him, not because of what he could give, but because he was part of their world. He was loved, perhaps most of all, by the rhythm of existence, the way the tide always returned, the way the moon never failed to rise, the way the world kept breathing no matter how much had been lost. And so he embraced his solitude, not as a punishment but as a kind of home. The sea did not need noise to be alive. Neither did he. The waves did not need names to be real. Neither did his emotions. He found companionship not in crowds or ceremony, but in patterns. The same rock worn smooth by water century after century. The same wave reaching for the same shore. The same silence between storms. And so Poseidon lived not above the sea, but within it. Not separate, but inseparable. His loneliness did not vanish, but it softened, changed shape. It became something tender, a space he carried, a chamber in the great cathedral of the ocean where others might one day rest. He no longer searched for those who would understand him completely. He simply made room for them should they arrive. And whether they did or didn't, the sea would go on. The tides would turn. The deep would breathe. And he would be there, silent, steady, listening. A god, yes. A force of nature, yes. But more than that, a keeper of space. A guardian of stillness. A presence large enough to hold the world's forgetting. And gentle enough to remember what even time has lost. In that, he was never truly alone. He was the sea, and the sea is always full. Chapter 7, The Creatures of the Deep. Long before humans mapped the ocean's surface with ink and parchment, long before they dropped their nets and cast lines into waters they barely understood, Poseidon walked among creatures that would never see sunlight. In the quiet kingdoms beneath the crushing weight of the sea, life flourished not with color or song, but with glow and silence. Giant squid coiled their arms around mountains of rock. Transparent fish hovered like dreams caught mid-motion. Whales moved like memories, slow, heavy, mournful. And in the dark, shimmering corridors of the deep, Poseidon did not rule as a king above subjects. He belonged. These creatures had no names, no words, no offerings to give. Yet he loved them more purely than he ever loved the marble temples carved in his image. For they asked nothing. They did not beg for favor or fear his wrath. They existed in quiet communion, and in their presence he felt something close to peace. In those depths he moved without need for form. Sometimes he was a shadow, long and slow, passing behind curtains of silt. Other times he was the current itself, wrapping gently around the soft bodies of sleeping jellyfish, or guiding schools of lanternfish through caverns they'd never swum before. The sea creatures never flinched. They recognized his presence not through eyes or thought, but through pressure, rhythm, vibration, like a second heartbeat in the water. When Poseidon rested, great manta rays would circle above him as if keeping watch. When he rose, ancient sea turtles would adjust their course, swimming beside him for miles without question. There was no fear, no worship, only trust. Trust that he was part of their world, not separate from it. Trust that his steps through their silence would never tear or bruise. This was not dominion. This was harmony. There were moments, quiet, precious moments, when he would sit motionless for hours beside a creature older than cities. A whale the size of a hill, with eyes like slow-moving stars. They would not speak, but something passed between them. A pulse, a presence, a shared stillness that needed no language. Poseidon would place his hand on the creature's skin, and through it, he would feel time stretch. He would remember things he had not seen. Volcanoes birthing islands, glaciers pulling back from coastlines, civilizations rising and sinking like sandcastles in the surf. The creature, too, would feel him. The weight of sorrow, the pressure of endless watching, the patience of tides. And for that moment they would simply be together in the deep. No movement, no sound, just life felt fully. There was something sacred in that. Not divine in the way Olympus understood it, but holy in a quieter, older way, the kind of holiness that glows in the dark, the kind that breathes slow and deep. The ocean was vast, but its creatures were never invisible to Poseidon. He knew them not by name, names were a mortal invention, but by feeling. Each had a rhythm, a frequency, a pattern in the current that marked their existence. The hum of migrating whales, the staccato pulses of bioluminescent shrimp, the slow drift of jellyfish through canyons of lightless water. He felt them all as clearly as one might feel the beat of a drum in their chest. They did not cry out for his attention, but he gave it freely. When a pod of dolphins became lost in an unexpected whirlpool, he guided them out with a single flick of current. When a bloom of plankton began to die in water made too warm by forces above, he stirred colder flows from the deep to cool them gently. These were not grand gestures, not thunder or flame, just small, precise shifts, acts of quiet care that no one saw, but the sea remembered. There were times, too, when the ocean's balance was broken. Oil would bleed from ships above, blackening the surface. Nets would sink too deep and scrape across coral gardens Poseidon had tended for centuries. He would feel the pain instantly, a shiver through the deep, a pulse of confusion in the fish, a silence where once there was vibrant sound. He never responded with wrath. The sea's anger is not fast. It is slow, patient, wide. Instead of rage, he would send currents to carry the poison away. He would cradle wounded turtles in swirls of healing salt water. He would lift shattered coral back toward sunlight, giving it another chance to root and regrow. He could not stop all harm. The ocean was too large, and the surface too far removed from understanding. But he could tend. Like a gardener in a realm without soil, he moved from reef to trench, watching, adjusting, encouraging life to thrive where it might have failed. Some creatures followed him always, shadows in his wake. A massive squid, long as a ship's mast, who moved with surprising grace. A school of tiny silver fish that darted in perfect spirals around his form, like stars orbiting a moon. Even a blind shark, scarred and ancient, that kept near him like an old friend, silent and steady. He did not summon them. They came on their own, not because they worshipped him, but because they knew him. Not the Poseidon sung about in myths, not the god painted in mosaics with clenched jaw and crashing trident, but the one who listened, the one who stayed, the one who, even after millennia, still moved gently through their world, touching nothing he could not carry, carrying only what needed to heal. Among these creatures he was not lord. He was kin, and in that kinship there was peace. In the deepest part of the sea, where light had never touched and silence lived not as absence but as a kind of breath, Poseidon kept a sanctuary. It was not a palace, not a temple, not something crafted by hands or adorned with jewels. It was a space of still water, held between ancient cliffs of black stone, where no current disturbed the calm and no creature feared. Here the most fragile beings came, those that lived in translucent skin, whose hearts beat slower than time, who drifted through life without teeth or shell or spine. They came because they felt safe, because Poseidon had made this place for them. No predator dared enter. Even sharks turned away. The water there carried a hum, a pulse of his own presence, steady and low, like the sound of sleep. And in this quiet basin, life that would have perished elsewhere survived. Not because it was strong, but because it was allowed. Poseidon would visit often, but never to interfere. He did not touch. He did not stir the water. He would simply float above the sanctuary and watch. Not as a god, not even as a protector, but as a witness. He admired the way a single jellyfish pulsed in perfect rhythm, how it moved with purpose and without effort. He marveled at the flicker of a creature so small it could live inside a raindrop, yet carry color like a sky at sunset. He listened to their lives, silent, delicate, brief, and felt no urge to extend them, to shape them, to make them more. They were enough, in their stillness, in their being. He learned from them patience, presence, the wisdom of existing fully in a moment, even if that moment would pass unnoticed by the world. He had ruled oceans, shaped continents, stirred waves that reached across hemispheres. But here, in this fragile cradle of life, he found reverence, not for power, for peace. And sometimes, just before leaving, he would lower his hand into the water, not to command, but to feel. A few of the braver creatures would drift near, One might touch his palm with a glowing tendril, another with a brush of fins so faint it felt like memory. And Poseidon, mighty among gods, would close his eyes and let that moment hold him. No throne, no storm, no titles, only water, lightless and full. Only life, unnoticed by most, but never by him. In those quiet minutes he felt not alone, but whole. These were his companions, not by oath or birth or name, but by presence. Creatures of the deep, who asked nothing, expected nothing, feared nothing. And Poseidon, god of endless oceans, carried them with him wherever he went. In every current, in every breath of tide, in every silence between thunder and wave. He did not need them to speak. He only needed them to be. And they were, and so was he. Chapter 8, Tides of Love and Longing. To love, for a god, is to reach across eternity with open hands. It is not fire, not chase, not the rush that mortals confuse for passion. It is deeper, slower, and infinitely more painful. Poseidon had known many forms of love, each one different, each one fleeting like foam on a tide. There were nymphs whose laughter rang through sea caves and vanished like echoes. There were queens and mortal women whose hearts beat for a moment beside his, warm and bright before fading into dust. And once, perhaps, something more, a connection not born from desire or legacy, but from understanding. A woman whose eyes saw the sea not as distance or danger, but as a mirror. Someone who sat beside the shore not to fear it or praise it, but to feel it. Her name was long forgotten, lost to time and myth, but Poseidon remembered her, not with longing, but with stillness. She had once reached out and touched the water, not knowing he was watching, and whispered, "You feel like home." No one had ever said that to him, not Olympus, not even his kin. And yet, even that tenderness had drifted away, as all mortal things do. She grew older, her hands grew frail, her feet no longer walked the beach, and Poseidon, for all his power, could only watch. He did not interfere. He did not extend her life. That was not his place. He simply kept the shoreline calm until her final breath, and when she passed, he carried her last sigh into the deep like a sacred offering. He did not mourn as mortals mourn. His grief did not cry out or crumble. It folded inward, like a wave returning to the sea, soft and eternal. From that day on, every time a woman stood quietly at the water's edge, Poseidon watched, not with hope but with memory, a kind of patient ache, not to reclaim love, but to recognize it when it arrived again. And though centuries passed and voices changed, he never stopped looking for that stillness in another's gaze, the stillness that says, "I see you." Amphitrite, the queen of the sea, had once come close. She was calm where he was storm, quiet where he was current. She had not wanted to be found. When he first approached her, she vanished into coral caverns for days. Poseidon, respectful of her silence, did not chase. He waited, and when she finally returned, she did not speak of love or titles. She simply sat beside him in the shallows, their shoulders touching, and let the tide wash over their feet. It was not a grand romance. There were no vows, no declarations, only a kind of shared rhythm, a knowing. Over time, they drifted together like twin currents, rarely colliding, but always circling the same center. She was not his to own, and he was not hers. They were companions in silence. And though she did not fill the ache in him completely, she softened it. She reminded him that connection did not always need heat or urgency. Sometimes it could simply be presence, the comfort of not being alone. Poseidon had lived for ages among the rhythms of life, yet he was always learning when it came to love. He had once thought love was something he could give or even create, like the harbors he shaped or the islands he raised from the seafloor. He thought it could be summoned, that it might arrive with a wave and stay like the tide. But over time, he learned that love was not something to be held. It was something to be allowed. It arrived softly, like a morning mist, and slipped away just as gently. He began to see that love had nothing to do with grand gestures. A blooming coral garden given to a maiden would not make her stay. A calm sea could not quiet a restless heart. And even a God's promise, eternal and deep as the ocean, could not bind another soul to his own. So he stopped trying to shape love into permanence. He let it move, let it breathe, let it leave when it needed to, even if it left him hollow for a time. And yet, in that letting go, he began to feel something new, something softer than possession and deeper than desire. He began to love without expectation, without urgency. He would find himself drawn to the quiet rituals of mortals, a woman brushing her hair on the beach at dawn, two lovers sitting back to back, watching the tide roll in without speaking, a fisherman lighting a lantern and whispering to the water before setting out. These moments held no grandeur, but they shimmered with presence. And Poseidon, though unseen, would linger nearby, not to take, not to intervene, just to witness. These moments reminded him of what he had always longed for. Not worship, not power, but simply to be part of something small and meaningful. A heartbeat beside another, a pause that held both breath and memory. He learned to cherish these fragments, even if they lasted only an instant, even if they were never meant for him. Sometimes he would walk the ocean floor and feel an ache he could not name. It was not sadness and not quite longing. It was more like an empty space within him shaped exactly like another's presence. Someone who might someday understand him completely. But he did not rush to fill it. He had come to see that even longing had a place in the great rhythm of things. It was the still water between tides, the breath before the wave, kept him open, soft, listening. And perhaps that was the truest kind of love he could offer, to remain open, even when alone, to be vast, not to consume, but to contain, to hold the world gently, even when the world did not see him. This was not the love mortals wrote about in poems, but it was love all the same, quiet, enduring, shaped by water and time. There came a time, far into the ages, when Poseidon no longer searched for love in the places it had once lived. He no longer waited at the shorelines for someone to return, nor did he seek out fleeting beauty in the passing faces of mortals. Instead, he began to notice how love had seeped into every part of him, like salt in the sea, present whether acknowledged or not. It was in the way he steadied a ship too close to the rocks without being seen, in the way he cooled the currents around a tired whale making its final journey, in the way he watched the moon rise, night after night, her silver gaze never meeting his, and still loved her for her consistency, for her quiet company across the sky. Love, he realized, had nothing to do with possession. It was not something that needed to be reciprocated to be real. It was simply the way he moved through the world, open, watchful, willing. Sometimes he would pass beneath ships carrying couples hand in hand, not knowing he drifted just below. He would feel their joy like warmth filtering through the water. He would offer them calm seas, not as a gift to earn favor, but because it felt right. At other times, he would pass lonely travelers standing at the edge of docks, staring into the horizon with eyes that said they had lost something they could not name. He would lift the wind just enough to ruffle their hair or shape the waves into patterns they might think were messages. Not to trick them, not to speak, but to remind them that they were not as alone as they felt, that the sea saw them, that someone somewhere had noticed. And in doing so, Poseidon discovered something new. Love did not need to be loud. It did not need form or future. It could live in gestures too small to see, in acts of care that left no mark but changed everything more and more. He found himself drawn not to the desire for love, but to the act of loving. Loving without claim, without end, not as a means to be known, but as a way of being. The sea gave and gave and gave again, not because it was asked to, but because it could. And so did he. He stopped asking when love would return to him. He stopped measuring his worth in how close someone stood or how long they stayed. Instead, he asked himself only this: did I soften the world today? Did I carry something for another, even if they never knew? Did I let the tide of my care reach a distant shore and leave it a little warmer, a little calmer than before? And more often than not, the answer was yes. And so Poseidon, god of oceans and ache, of tides and tenderness, continued to move through the world, not as one who lacked love, but as one who had become it. Not the kind sung about in heroic tales or carved into marble, but the quiet kind, the steady kind, the kind that waits in the waves and listens when no one else does, the kind that carries the whole weight of the world and never asks for anything in return. Chapter 9: The Wrath He Never Wanted. It was easy from the outside to call Poseidon a god of rage. The crashing waves, the earthquakes, the floods that swallowed whole cities. These were the signs mortals saw and feared. They carved stories into stone and sang warnings into lullabies. Do not anger the sea, or he will rise. But those stories never told the full truth. They missed the part where Poseidon waited, where he held back for centuries, where he listened quietly as his waters were polluted, his creatures hunted to silence, his offerings replaced with forgetfulness. His wrath, when it came, was never sudden. It was slow, deep, and sorrowful, like a tide building beneath the surface, rising with each careless step taken above it. He did not want to be feared. He wanted to be felt, to be honored not with temples, but with tenderness. But time wore down his patience, the way water wears down stone, until all that remained was the motion of his pain, rising relentless. There were times when the cries of the sea creatures reached him not in sound, but in sensation. A tremble in the water, a quiet absence where once there was movement. He would descend to coral beds turned pale and lifeless, forests of kelp shredded by steel. He would run his hands through silt where fish once swam, and feel only the cold weight of what had been lost. It was not anger that rose in him, but grief. Grief so vast it could only take the shape of storm. The skies darkened not because he willed it, but because his sorrow was too heavy to contain. The sea, like any living being, responded to his state. And when Poseidon grieved, the world trembled. Ships were tossed not as punishment, but as reflections of imbalance. The sea cracked and surged, not to destroy, but to express. He did not lash out with joy. He took no pleasure in ruin. His wrath was not vengeance. It was mourning that had nowhere else to go. And yet he was called cruel. He was blamed for every flood, every quake, every shattered shoreline. Mortals did not see that many times. He held the storm within himself until it bruised his very soul. They did not know how many disasters he had prevented, how many waves he had calmed just before they rose. No poems were written about restraint. No temples thanked him for tides that receded. And still he did not harden. He carried the misunderstanding like a weight in his chest, letting it settle there. There were days he wanted to retreat forever into the deep and let the surface forget him completely. But then he would feel a small hand toss a stone into the water, a child laughing at the splash, and something in him would soften. He would remember that not all had turned away. Some still felt the sea. And so he stayed, not to punish, not to rage, but to wait, and to hope that one day the world would learn to listen again, not to his anger but to the pain that caused it. When Poseidon's wrath did break free, it was never as sudden as mortals imagined. It built like thunder in a distant sky, slow, gathering, patient. He would feel it first as a tightness in the current, a tremble in the deep trenches of his realm, the kind that made even ancient whales swim slower, more carefully. The sea would whisper to him in fractured tones, telling him what had been broken, what had been forgotten, not out of vengeance, but out of sorrow. It was sorrow that took the form of storms. It was loss that churned the waves into walls of water. His emotions did not rush forward like fire. They pooled slowly until the weight of them could no longer be held. And when the storms rose, they were not wild tantrums. They were elegies, grief shaped into motion, memory turned to rain and wind. Cities that had long ignored the sea would finally hear its voice, but by then, the voice would be thunder. Still, even in fury, Poseidon held restraint. There was always a place within him that remembered the fragile things. He would steer waves away from a sleeping village, or let a fishing boat pass untouched while the winds howled around it. His anger was vast, but never careless. He did not destroy for the sake of power. He simply had no other language left to speak his sorrow. And when the storm was over, when the water fell still again, he would sink beneath the waves, lower than sight, and sit alone on the ocean floor. Not triumphant, not relieved, but quiet, weary, like a father who has shouted only to realize no one was truly listening. The sea would be calm once more, but inside Poseidon, something would remain unsettled. The pain of having to shout at all, of knowing that his gentleness had been ignored for so long that only rage could make the world pause. There were times he wondered if his own nature betrayed him, that perhaps by being made of sea and storm, he had never been given the tools to express his heart in ways the world could understand. He envied the stillness of Hades, the fire of Zeus, forces more legible to mortals, more easily mythologized. But Poseidon was water, ever-shifting, hard to hold, impossible to define. His love, his grief, his warnings, they all arrived in motion, and motion is so often misread as threat. But how else could he speak? He could not carve his feelings into stone. He could not inscribe them in the stars. He could only move the ocean, and in doing so, hope that someone, somewhere, would learn to feel his meaning not as punishment, but as presence. A presence that only wanted to be met, not with fear, but with understanding. And until that day came, he would carry his storms inside him, quietly, patiently, ready to rise only when the sea could no longer bear the weight of silence. In the quiet that followed his storms, Poseidon would always return to stillness, not because the fury had passed, but because it had spoken. The sea, vast and endless, needed to exhale, and so did he. As waves smoothed out and clouds thinned into threads of silver across the sky, he would descend once more to his solitude, letting the silence press against his skin like cool cloth. He did not gloat. He did not measure the damage. Instead, he listened to the coral beginning again, to the sand settling in patterns newly made, to the silence left behind, filled with questions no one yet knew how to ask. In that silence, Poseidon was not a wrathful god. He was a presence, exhausted by being misunderstood, not angry for the sake of anger, but aching for someone, anyone, to realize that his storms were not rage unleashed, but a language of last resort, that he would pass by ruined coastlines not with triumph, but with eyes lowered. The wreckage was never his goal. It was a wound left raw, visible, a message written in wave and wind. Sometimes, in the days after, a few would understand. A child would walk to the shoreline and speak softly into the breeze. A sailor would place a piece of driftwood into the tide, letting it float away like an apology. These acts did not undo the harm, but they mattered. They meant someone had felt the sea, not just its power, but its pain. Poseidon would stay near those shores a little longer. He would calm the currents, stir the fish gently back to their paths. And in these small moments, he would believe, if only for a while, that perhaps the world was learning to listen not to the volume of the waves, but to their meaning. In time, even the most intense storms faded into myth. Mortals spoke of Poseidon as tempest, as fury, as judge. But they forgot the weight behind his roar. They forgot how long he had held peace before the first wave rose. They forgot how many times he had chosen mercy, silence, stillness. And so he became a warning, not a teacher. A name spoken with fear, not reverence. Yet Poseidon never tried to rewrite his story. He did not demand they see him differently. He simply continued. Like the tides, he came and went, steady and true, offering calm far more often than chaos. His wrath would always be a part of him, just as storms are part of the sea. But it was not the whole. It was only the crest of the wave, not the deep beneath. And Poseidon, old and ever listening, would always return to that deep. For even in his fury, he had never stopped hoping that one day, his voice would no longer need to be a storm. Chapter 10: The Endless Ocean Within. The sea has no ending, only shifts in depth. It does not conclude, it continues. So too did Poseidon, long after the world above changed, long after cities rose and fell, long after prayers faded into silence. He did not disappear. He did not grow bitter or cold. Instead, he became quieter, deeper, like the ocean's own breath, slow and constant beneath the waves. He watched time ripple across the world's surface and let it pass. Empires came and went. Languages bloomed and vanished. But the sea endured, and so did he. Not as a figure of fear or even reverence, but as presence, endless, unseen, and unmistakable. To most, he was myth, a story told in salt and thunder. But beneath the waters, Poseidon remained, not ruling, not retreating, but existing, breathing, listening, and in that eternal stillness, he became something more than God. He became the ocean itself, its memory, its longing, its ancient calm. There were no final acts for him, no climactic moments, only tides, some strong, some soft, each one carrying him farther inward. In solitude, he discovered that the greatest power is not to shape the world, but to hold space within it, to remain when others have forgotten, to witness what no one else can see. He became the pause between waves, the hush between storms. Sailors who drifted too far from shore would sometimes feel a strange calm, as though something vast was near but meant no harm. A distant pull like gravity beneath the waterline. That was him, not intervening, not revealing, but offering presence. Those who listened closely sometimes felt peace, though they could not say why. The feeling of being held by something too ancient to name. That was also him. And in those moments, Poseidon knew he did not need to be known to be real. He did not need to be worshipped to matter. He only needed to remain. In the quietest parts of the sea, where time does not move the same and light cannot reach, he found reflection. He drifted not through kingdoms or temples, but through himself. Every current he had ever called, every sorrow he had ever held, every love he had ever lost. He carried it all like sediment, layered gently in the chambers of his soul. He did not try to forget. The sea does not erase, it absorbs, and so did he. He became the keeper of all things unspoken, the apology never given, the grief never named, the love never returned. These were his treasures now, not gold, not pearls, but moments. Fleeting, fragile, and endlessly precious. They filled him more fully than any offering ever had. And in this way, Poseidon became whole, not because he had been completed, but because he had embraced his own incompleteness, like the sea itself, never still, never finished, but always full. Poseidon no longer needed shape to exist. He could become the weightless pull beneath the tide, or the hush that settles just before a wave touches shore. He was not bound to a throne or a temple. He was not contained in the trident once forged for battle. All those forms had served their time. Now he was the movement itself, the space between moments, the feeling of being watched by something that has always been there. He flowed through underwater valleys carved by time, past creatures older than sunlight, and through currents that had never met the sky. In these places he did not speak. There was no need. The sea knew him and he knew the sea. They had become the same. Every ripple of the ocean was an echo of his heartbeat. Every deep, steady current was a whisper of his thought. He was no longer a god who controlled the water. He was the water that remembered it had once been a god. And yet he was not detached. He remained attentive. When a whale sang across the trench, Poseidon listened. When coral began to glow faintly in warming waters, he noticed. When a single tiny fish changed its path and darted into the unknown, he followed, not with eyes, but with presence. These small things mattered. They had always mattered. If the world was to remember anything of him, he hoped it would be this, that even in the silence, even in the deep, something was listening. Something was watching, not to judge, but to hold, not to rule, but to carry. He no longer sought the voices of mortals, but when a child threw a pebble into the sea and whispered a hope, Poseidon heard it. He carried it gently, and sometimes, far from shore, he would guide a dolphin near that child's boat or send a curious gust of wind to lift their hair, just enough to make them smile and wonder if maybe the sea had smiled back. He never spoke of endings, not to himself, not to the sea. The ocean did not end. It folded, and Poseidon folded with it. He was in every drop of rain that touched the waves, in every fog that rolled in at dawn, in every still moment when the sea was so quiet that the world seemed to lean in to hear it breathe. He no longer needed myths. He no longer needed marble. What he had was presence, and presence, he learned, was enough. That was the secret he had carried for ages, to simply remain, not to dominate, not to dazzle, but to be. For even gods, in the end, are not remembered by their storms, but by the calm that follows. And Poseidon had become the calm. He was the endless ocean within. There will always be those who look out over the sea and feel something they can't quite name. A quiet comfort, a pull just beneath their ribs, a stillness that doesn't ask for words. They may never know why. They may never speak his name. But Poseidon will be there, just beneath the surface, not as a storm, not as a god, but as something older than memory and gentler than belief. He is in the spaces between the waves, in the hush that comes before a deep breath, in the warmth of salt on skin after swimming far from shore. He has become the part of the world that listens when no one else does. The ocean was never his to own, but he became part of it, and it, in turn, became part of everyone who has ever stood before it and closed their eyes. Even now, as the world above becomes louder, faster, filled with motion that forgets its source, Poseidon waits. He does not ask to be remembered. He does not seek devotion. His strength is not in being seen, but in being felt, in the way the sea wraps around tired legs at the end of a long walk, in the rhythm that rocks a boat to sleep, in the echo that answers when someone whispers their thoughts into the wind and hears the waves whisper back. It is there, in those moments, that Poseidon's soul moves, quiet, deep, and steady. He has become a tide within the world, rising and falling in every life, a memory not written in stone, but held in water. He needs no ending because he was never a story. He was a presence, and presence, once felt, is never truly gone. So the sea continues, and Poseidon with it. He is not waiting for a return, not hoping for a future myth. He is content to be what he is. The calm that follows the storm, the silence that holds the story, the hand beneath the surface that carries without claiming. And for those who still seek peace, who close their eyes at night and imagine waves lapping gently at the shore, he is already there, rocking them slowly, like the world's oldest lullaby. The god is not gone. He has simply become something deeper, something quieter, something endless. He is the ocean. He is the memory. He is the breath that never needed to be loud to be felt. And so, even now, he remains always here, always listening, always home, if you're still awake. Thank you for spending time here, in the quiet with Poseidon, where the sea doesn't shout. It remembers. If this story helped you drift closer to rest, leave a gentle like, or subscribe to join me again. There are more stories to tell, slowly, softly, without rush. Until next time, may the tides be calm, and may you always feel that somewhere out there, something ancient is listening.